All right, you guys, as you can see by the thumbnail, I'm back with another one, and I'm going to jump straight into this. It's getting late, and I want to try to get this out to you guys by tonight. Anyways, this story right here, it's a little different. This didn't happen in the state. This happened in a federal USB. To be specific, it happened in Lewisburg. So let me get straight into this story right here. So like I said, this story took place in Lewisburg. It's a USP. This is a prison that you hear a lot about. And at the time that this story took place, Sana from Orange County was there. You had Willie Bobo from Redondo Beach, Chino from National City, and you had China Boy from Artesia. So all these guys had been there for a good minute. They got it established. They got Glavo coming in. They're having it their way out there. So China Boy from Artesia was a well-respected Mexican Mafia member that had picked up a 32-year bid behind getting caught up in that first Mexican Mafia racketeering indictment, that federal indictment back in the early 90s. You had Randy Cowboy Therian, you had Pee Wee Aguirre from the Avenues, you had Wedo Shai Shrayak, Smiley-On Gallardo, Dan Barella. But these were some of the main Mexican Mafia members that were involved in that case. China Boy was 27 years old when he was convicted in 1997, and I believe there was 13. He had 13 co-defendants in that indictment. So China Boy, he's been there in Lewisburg for a while. He's been there for a minute, and at some point, an individual by the name of Jose Psycho Cadera from Pasadena, he pulls up. And as soon as he gets there, him and China Boy, they basically hit it off. They're like two peas in a pod. They're, always out there on the yard together. They're running around together. They click. They're around the same age. And, they eventually they end up selling up. So when China Boy moves Psycho in the cell with them, he starts to educate him. He starts to bring him up to, with the culture, with the history. He starts to basically pass on the schooling that he picked up. He starts to indoctrinate him. And, at this point, Psycho wasn't a Mexican Mafia member, but as China Boy continued to give him this education, he had intentions on trying to pull Psycho. So once Psycho moves in the cell with China Boy starts to indoctrinate Psycho. He starts to pass on a lot of the schooling that he's absorbed over the years. And you got to remember, China Boy was a young Imero at that time. He was still young. He was still learning, but he was well educated. So he starts to give him the culture. He starts to give him the history. He starts to pass on all the things that he's learned throughout time. And China Boy doesn't have the authority. He doesn't have the pull to recruit Psycho to pull him in and to make him, but he has intentions on raising his hand for him. Later on, he would end up sponsoring Psycho. But at this point, they're in the cell together and they're using their time productively. He's educating them. So at some point, China Boy decides to sponsor Psycho. And, China Boy, he gets at some of the other senior members that are out there on the yard. Willie Bobo. I don't believe Sana was directly right there on that yard. I think Sana was somewhere in one of the lockup units from what I understood. But you got Chino from National City out there, and Willie Bobo. Mainly Willie Bobo was like the senior member out there. But China Boy, he gets at him and he's like, you know what? I want to bring this brother in. He's solid. I think he'll make a good brother. I want to make him. And Willie Bobo, he'd been around and he was more selective about who they brought into the Mexican Mafia. And he told China Boy off top, he was like, you know what? We don't know this guy. We don't have enough information about him. I'm sure he's a solid individual, but we just don't have enough information to pull this guy. I'm not comfortable with it. I know you want to bring him in, but, we don't have enough information to pull him in good faith. So China Boy, he gets at Chino from National City and he tells Chino, he's like, man, let's bring him in. He's a solid dude. I've been working with him in the cell. And he's got a strong mind. He's got a good head on his shoulders. He's like, man, I know he'd make a good brother. Let's back me up on this. Let's bring him in. So Chino from National City, he agrees to bring in Psycho. And eventually Willie Bobo, he signs off on it. He's like, hey, you know what? You want to bring him in? That's on you. He's like, honestly, I really don't feel like there's enough information to pull this guy. And that's usually not how we do things. But if you brothers feel like he's a good prospective member, then by all rights, go ahead. You guys can make him. The general consensus on the yard was that they didn't have enough information. Even from my understanding, Chino from National City, initially he was like, I don't know this guy. I don't have any information on his past, on his history. And, when they're making a member like that, somebody usually has to know their history. Somebody has to raise their hand. They can't just be sold up with them for a couple of weeks and say, you know what, he seems like a solid individual. Usually they know somebody that knows your history from your barrio, from your hood, somebody that can vouch for you and say, you know what, this guy, he grew up in the hood. He's never told on nobody. He's never been involved in no foul shit. This individual is a solid dude, never ran on nobody. I know his history, but they really didn't have nobody there like that. Nobody knew who this guy, Psycho from Pasadena, really was. But China Boy was the one that was really pushing for him. They became the best of friends, in the cell, and they were always running the yard together. And like I said, they were around the same age, so they clicked. Even though the general consensus was that they didn't feel like they had enough information to pull them, they still went ahead and signed off on it. Even though Willie Bobo explained to China Boys, like, look, bro, there's no need to rush these types of things. These types of things are, these are things that you got to really be careful with. You don't want to make a mistake of bringing somebody in, because at the end of the day, that's going to fall back on you. You're going to be accountable for that. You're the one that's going to have to answer if something comes up on this guy's, in his history. We find out that there's something that, something foul comes up. You're the one that's going to end up having to deal with it. And China Boy, for whatever reason, was adamant about it. He wanted to take full responsibility for it. He was like, man, I know this guy's solid. I've been sold up with him for however long they were sold up, and he's a solid dude. So again, they signed off on it and they recruited him. So not long after making Psycho official, after they made him, they pulled him right there on the yard. For whatever reason, they end up going to the hole. They all end up going to the hole for, I want to say it was for dirty test or something. It had something to do with drugs, but they all land in the hole. They land in the hole, and most of them end up coming back out to the yard on Lewisburg. However, Psycho ends up getting transferred out to a USP in Arizona. I want to say that there's a USP out there in Tucson, Arizona that used to be an active yard. And this was a yard that at one time, the Mexican Mafia, they had established the yard over there. So this is where they ended up sending Psycho to. Like I said, at that time when Psycho landed over there, this was an active yard. But I got the impression that as of today or sometime in the last couple of years, that yard was flipped and it's no longer considered an active yard. It's now a PC yard. So after Psycho gets there, after he's there for a couple of days, he gets out to the yard, he makes his rounds, he meets all the sureños that are out there on the yard. Eventually, he runs into an individual named Perico from Hawaiian Gardens. So this individual, Perico, he introduces himself as Perico from the Hawaiian Gardens. And, there's something off about this guy. He claims to be from Hawaiian Gardens, but he came from Albuquerque, New Mexico, and he's got Vertice tattooed across the front of his throat. Now, despite the fact that, despite these inconsistencies, Psycho doesn't seem to think that there's anything wrong with this. He doesn't, there's no red flags that go up. He doesn't question, why this guy's got Albuquerque blasted across the front of his throat when he's supposed to be from the Hawaiian Gardens. And then he doesn't even question the black hand that's tattooed on his chest. He embraces him as a fellow C. And at that point, he's the only other Mexican Mafia member that was supposedly out there on the yard. So he's out there with them. He embraces them. At no point does, he pull any paperwork. Does he question this guy? He doesn't do nothing like that. Understandably, he's a new Mexican Mafia member. That's understood. But this is common sense. Red flags should have been going up everywhere, because of the inconsistencies. And if nothing else, when he seen the black hand on his chest, that's when he should have started pulling paperwork, or he should have started, running checks on this guy. But he didn't do nothing. He didn't do none of that. He embraced him, and from that point on, they were inseparable out there on the yard. So he's out there with this guy for about a week. They're out there together, and they're always walking the track together. And at some point, this guy, something spooked him. He hears footsteps. He panics, and he checks in. Psycho had every opportunity to check this guy out. He had an opportunity to whack this dude, to find out who he was. So that was his first fuck up. I guess they ended up hearing about it in Lewisburg. They knew who this guy was. Psycho had an opportunity to whack this guy. He was out there with them for a good minute. He didn't. I guess the only thing that saved him was because he was a newly made member. So, they probably took that into consideration and said, you know what, we're going to give him a pass, but he fucked up. He should have got that dude. He should have pulled his paperwork. He should have ran a check on him, but he didn't do none of that. I still say that even though this guy's ink, didn't make sense, and Psycho didn't catch it from that point on, there's a certain way that sees NF members, Mexican Mafia members, they walk, talk, carry themselves. There should have been characteristics, different things about them that Psycho should have picked up on. But regardless, he didn't, and it was what it was. But based on the fact that this guy checked in, that definitely meant that there was something going on with this guy. He had skeletons in the closet. There was something going on with him. So after some time goes by, after this dude checks in, Psycho's still out there. That yard, there was a lot of dope out there on the yard. There was a shitload of dope coming in. And being that Psycho was Mexican Mafia member, a newly made member, he took control of that yard. So dope's coming in, and Psycho starts using dope. He starts using a lot of dope. He doesn't just indulge here and there. He starts like getting twacked out to the point to where it just becomes bad. A lot of Sureños are questioning his status. Like, man, who is this dude? He's walking around on the yard tweaked out. He's starting to have, Sureños, good Sureños, whacked over stupid shit. And, people are questioning whether or not Psycho was legit, just based on the shit that he was doing out there on the yard. So once his nose was open and he started using, that became his main focus at that point. He started to focus on how to get more dope in to support his habit. He started having Sureños hit over dope because they weren't bringing it in. Some of the stories that I've told you guys about, whether it was because somebody didn't want to bring in a certain amount of dope, or because they slid back and said that, they fell back and said they didn't want to bring it in no more because maybe the old lady started to get spooked. Whatever the reason was, the same issues started to take place out there on the yard with Psycho, and he started to have these individuals hit a lot of good Sureños. And, this was a ballsy move for a newly made member. Somebody like Psycho that just came into the organization, he should have been trying to fly up under the radar and, build a solid reputation for himself. But he was already going down the wrong path. So aside from, Psycho having Sureños whacked out there, good Sureños, a situation ends up escalating with the paisas, and they end up getting off with the paisas. The Sureños and the paisas get off. So Psycho ends up getting rolled up with a bunch of Sureños, and they lose the yard as a result of that melee. I'm not sure what it was over, but from everything that I was told, it was a petty situation that never should have happened. But, because Psycho ended up getting rolled up, he's the only Mexican Mafia member out there, and a lot of the good Sureños that were out there all got rolled up. They ended up losing the yard. Mind you, this was the second closest yard to the West Coast. So they put a lot of emphasis on trying to maintain control of this yard. So after this situation ends up happening with the paisas, Psycho ends up losing the yard. Not long after that, they end up flipping that yard, and they turned it into a PC yard. Apparently, there's a lot of yards like that, PC yards. They're lower level custody yards in the federal prison system that are like SNY yards. I didn't know that until recently, but This prison right here in Tucson, Arizona, was a prison that the Mexican mafia had ran and had established for a while. But because of that situation, and Psycho was getting blamed for it, they lost that yard. So after that situation took place in Tucson, Arizona, Psycho ends up catching a chain back to Lewisburg. He ends up back in Lewisburg, back on the same yard where China Boy's at, Willie Bobo, and I want to say Sano was in another part of the prison, and then Chino from National City was still there. So all the same guys that were there when he left, they were still there. And when Psycho hit the yard, his first cellie was Casper from Florencia. Not from Florencia in California, but Florencia in Washington State. Guess they got another Florencia out there. But his first cellie was Casper from Florencia. So Psycho, he's celled up with Casper for a month or two. They're celled up, they're in there together, and at first everything's cool. But eventually they start bumping heads. They start bumping heads, and it gets so bad that it ends up turning physical. At one point, when Casper was cuffed up, Psycho takes off on him. He takes off on him when he's cuffed up. You know, keep in mind, Casper wasn't in bad standings. So it wasn't like he didn't have a fair one coming. If they were bumping heads, you know, Psycho could have let him move out of the cell, or, you know, if it was going to get physical, Psycho could have at least gave him a heads up. But to snake him when he had the cuffs on, it was not only a dirty move, but it was a move that wasn't looked at favorably by the other Sureños. They looked at it for what it was. It was a PC move, and it was an act of cowardice. You don't take off on somebody when they have their cuffs on. For one, again, it's a PC move, and for two, they can't defend themselves. And at the end of the day, this was all over a personal disagreement. Again, he wasn't a piece of shit. He wasn't somebody that had smut on him or something like that. Psycho just got tired of, you know, him in the cell for whatever reason, and the first opportunity that he had when Casper was cuffed up, he took off on him. But as is the case with a lot of dudes like Casper that end up getting into a conflict, you know, when they're just like a Norteño or a Sureño and they're celled up with a Mexican Mafia member or an NF member or an Aryan Brotherhood member, somebody like that, a MAID member, they end up getting into it with them. A lot of the times they'll check in because they're looking at it as, you know what, when it's all said and done, you know, they're going to look at it as, hey, you got into it with the Mexican Mafia member and you're the one that's in the wrong. He probably felt like Psycho was probably going to push a line against him. And at the end of the day, he was going to be the one that was wrong, regardless of the fact that he was in his handcuffs and he didn't even get to swing back or, you know, really fight with Psycho. He figured, you know what, this guy's probably going to push a line against me, so I'm just going to go ahead and get up out the way. You know, it's an unfortunate situation because from everything that I was told, Casper was a solid Sureño, but he ends up checking in because, you know, Psycho was probably in there, you know, throwing his weight around, bullying them and shit like that. And, you know, you got a good Sureño that they ended up losing behind some bullshit. So that was his first selling. And like I said, needless to say, it wasn't like, you know, Psycho gained a lot of respect from taking off on Casper with his handcuffs on. Other Sureños heard about it, and I'm sure, you know, they were talking about like, man, that was some foul shit, you know, that to take off on a homie with when he had his handcuffs on, that you do that to somebody that's a piece of shit, somebody that's got it coming, not a solid Sureño or somebody that's functioning. So obviously Psycho is going down the wrong path. He's already lost a yard. You know, he's got a reputation now for being a stone cold dope fiend. He's snaking solid Sureños with their handcuffs on, and he's just carrying himself like he's a tyrant. I know you really can't tell by looking at him in this picture because he's sitting down, but you know, Psycho is he's a pretty good sized dude. He's 6'2", 6'3", and he's around 260, 280 pounds. So after the incident with Casper, Psycho ends up moving in with another Sureño named Largo from Southside Locals. They're celled up for about another good month or two, and you know, for whatever reason, again, they start bumping heads. It's safe to assume that Psycho's just up in there pushing his weight around. This is the second cell he got into with. So obviously he was doing something in the cell that was creating conflict. You know, this is the second celly he's had within a couple of months already. So these guys, they end up going at it. They go, he doesn't take off on them with the handcuffs on. He takes off on Largo in the cell and he beats the brakes off him. Again, you know, Psycho's a big dude. And from what I was told, he was in the cell trying to punk Largo. So Largo was like, you know what, I'm not having it. And he stood up for his. And as a result, he ends up getting beat up. And now you got another good Sureño that's gone. So this guy's already beat up 2 cellies. He's on some crash dummy type of shit. You know what I mean? He's abusing his power, using his status to, you know, to basically bully Sureños. Good solid Sureños that were out there, you know, programming. So the other thing that Psycho started to do was, you know, I guess he started to push a hard line and he implemented a 0 tolerance drinking policy, which is a messed up thing to do because, you know, sometimes there's Sureños that are out there and that's the only thing that they got to look forward to. They don't use no dope. They don't indulge in none of that other stuff. They like to just drink a little bit of wine, you know, when they're watching football and just do it for strictly for social purposes. And that's cool. But Psycho started to push a hard line. He didn't want nobody drinking out there. So, you know, he implemented a no drinking policy. And if he caught you drinking, he'd end up having you whacked. So there were a couple Sureños that got caught drinking and he had them whacked. He had them removed off the yard. All these things he's doing, they're just all adding up to his resume. He's got a resume of things he's done, and they're all fuck ups. He hasn't done nothing for the organization, but make a bad name for himself. And it's starting to catch up to him. People are starting to take notice. So it was about this time that other brothers started taking notice of what he was doing. Willie Bobo was one of the main ones. He got in China Boy and he was like, hey, look, man, you know, your boy's fucking up. He lost a yard, you know, he got into a couple of physical altercations with some good solid Sureños already. You know, he was over there using dope. All the things that he did, you know, all these things were starting to catch up with him. And, you know, they're starting to question whether or not this was a good move to even make this guy now. Everything that he's standing for, he's starting to look like he's just a tyrant. So, you know, Willie Bobo tells China Boy, hey, man, this dude's fucking up. He's fucking up bad. You know what I mean? And keep in mind that they're still looking into his background. They're still trying to get information on Psycho because initially, like I told you guys, nobody really knew him. Nobody really knew about his background or none of that stuff. So, you know, even though they pulled him in, it wasn't like Willie Bobo and the other C's that were out there. It didn't stop them from continuing to look into his background, to write, you know, letters and to ask other, you know, people that they knew some of their channels. And who is this dude from Pasadena? What do you know about his background? So, you know, they had wrote a couple other places. I don't know, it was on the streets or other prisons, other federal USPs, and they started to run checks on this guy. So all these things are starting to, you know, they're starting to add up. Even Sana, from what I understand, started to lose his patience with him. He's like, who is this dude, you know, fucking up? I keep hearing his name. Every time I turn around, you know, there's something going on with this guy. He lost a yard already. You know, he got into a couple of physical altercations. He's got people, you know, he's removing people for stupid shit. Who is this dude? So, you know, all these things are starting to come to the surface. So because Psycho was a C, he was given, you know, authority to have a crew out there on the streets, out there in Pasadena. And, you know, he put a small crew together and they're out there and they're collecting taxes. They're running around on his behalf. So Psycho's crew out there on the streets, supposedly they start taxing a paisa. And this paisa, he's a big connection. He's out there moving a lot of weight. And somehow this paisa is tied in with an Africano. And at some point, you know, this paisa has a conversation with this Africano. I don't know who the Africano was, a blood or a crib, but he was somebody that was working with this paisa. You know, so the paisa tells him, he's like, hey, man, these guys, man, they're taxing me. They're taxing me for a lot of fucking money. It's like, I don't know who these guys are, but the Africano's like, who is it? And who are they taxing you on behalf of? So at some point, I guess the Paisa finds out that it's, on behalf of Psycho from Pasadena. So when he mentions this to this Africano, the Africano's like, what? Psycho from Pasadena? He's like, man, if it's the same dude I know, he's like, there's paperwork on that dude. That dude told on somebody when, he was in his like 17, 18 years old. He got caught up in some case where, he was buying crack or something like that, and he made a statement. It was a one-liner, the statement that he made. He said something to the effect of, I bought that crack from such and such. But you guys know how the Mexican mafia is. They're real meticulous about things like that. That's all it takes is a one-liner. It doesn't matter. If you drop somebody's name, you say something, you make a statement, that's it. You don't have to sit down and give a whole debrief. You don't have to tell your whole life story. You implicate somebody, and that somebody ends up going to jail, or they catch a case based off of your statement. That's it. You're a done deal. So this Africano tells the Paisa, that there's paperwork on him and or whatnot. And the next time, well, the Africano tells the Paisa, hey, the next time these dudes come around, call me so I can get at him and let him know. So apparently Psycho's crew, they end up coming back around and they jam this Paisa up to get some more tax money from him. And the Paisa, that's when he tells him, he's like, hey, this guy Psycho that you're working for, he's a snitch. He's a rat. And when he tells them that, they put tips on him. They don't know whether or not this information is good, but he's disrespecting a big homie. So they put tips on him. They whoop him. They beat him up, take his dough. And, the Paisa, he goes back at some point. He tells the Africano, he goes and he actually gets the paperwork. He goes down to the county clerk and he's like, man, this, that should have never happened to you. These guys, they probably don't know. They probably don't know that this dude has paperwork on him. So he goes and he gets a copy of the report. Well, let me back up. When Psycho's crew, when they put tips on the Paisa, the Paisa at that point told him that there's an Africano that told him about, the paperwork. And that's when they told the Paisa, hey, put us in touch with this Africano. We want to know more about this, who this Africano is that's saying that. So, after they put tips on the Paisa, the next time they come through, the Paisa calls the Africano. The Africano meets up with him and he's like, hey, look, here's the paperwork on this dude. So they see the paperwork and they're blown away. They're like, fuck, this dude's got paperwork on him. We've been working for him. The homies probably don't know. There's no way that they could know about this. So now the word is out. The word's out on the streets. And it's just a matter of time before that ends up making its way back to Lewisburg, where Psycho's at. As of right now, nobody really knows about it. There's only a few people that really know. And again, this was something that happened when Psycho was just a kid, when he was 17, 18 years old. So, it happened years ago. So, however, Psycho had his arrangement set up with his, the guys that were collecting his taxes out there on the streets. I guess at some point, the money doesn't come through that month. And, Psycho has to reach out to his crew and call him. He's like, hey, what's up with the tax money? What's up with the tax money for this month? I haven't got it yet. And that's when, his crew, these guys that were working for him, they tell him, they're like, hey, we can't fuck with you no more, bro. We can't fuck with you. We found out that you got paperwork on you. So when they tell that to Psycho, Psycho's like, what are you talking about? He's like, oh, so you guys want to go trump up some paperwork on me? Ain't no paperwork on me. He's like, I'm a fucking carnal. He's like, I don't know what you're talking about, but that's some bullshit. But they're like, hey, you know what? They were adamant. They're like, we can't fuck with you. We were told to cut you loose. So from that point on, now Psycho, he's tripping now. He's acting scary, and he doesn't want to sell up with nobody. And there's a big change in his character, but they still don't know what's going on there at Lewisburg. They hear that something should be coming from the streets, with regards to Psycho, but they don't really know what it is. So, Psycho, he's acting scary. He doesn't want to sell up with nobody. He's, his whole character changes. And at some point, he agrees to move back in with China Boy. So he moves back in with them. At that time, China Boy was housed in Z Block on the second tier. So they're cellies again. And I'm sure China Boy heard something, you know, that there's something coming in and it has something to do with Psycho. But even he doesn't know what it is. They're still tight. They're still boys. And you know, you got to remember, China Boy's the one that pulled Psycho. So Psycho has a lot of respect, or at least that's what people thought. He had a lot of respect for China Boy. Anyway, so in Lewisburg, there's a cadre unit that basically has open windows where, you know, and there's always guys walking by, and you know, they can yell up at the windows, and the people inside the building right there can hear them. And that's where China Boy was, on the other side of the window. So, you know, guys that were walking by, Sureños, they could yell up, "Hey, China Boy," and he would communicate like that with them. So apparently, you know, something was communicated to China Boy to the effect of, "Hey, you know, we're something's coming." So that's the code word. A couple days go by, and apparently there's some Sureños that are walking by, the ones that were in communication with China Boy, and they call up to him and they tell him, they're like, "Hey, you're gonna go see that Rose Bowl in Pasadena?" So boom, they got confirmation now. China Boy got confirmation. He knows it's all bad with Psycho, and you know, this is filtered out to Chino from National City and Willie Bobo. They know about it now. Now it's just a matter of how they're gonna get this individual, when they're gonna get him, how they're gonna get him, and I guess China Boy was supposed to get him in the cell. That was the plan, the tentative plan that they were supposedly working on. So nothing happens that day. The next day, China Boy goes to rec. He goes out to rec, and Psycho stays in the cell. Psycho's acting different. He knows something's going on, whether he caught something or he feels it in the climate. He knows something's going on. Something alerted him. Maybe he just put two and two together and was like, you know what? Maybe they're hearing about this shit that, you know, these cats told me about on the streets. You know, whether Psycho heard something, he heard some kind of communication, or he just picked up on something in the climate, something alerted him where, you know, he felt something was going to happen. So China Boy goes out to rec. He goes out to rec, and Psycho stayed in that day. And while China Boy was out there on the yard, you know, during his rec time, Psycho ripped up his sheet and braided a rope together. He put a rope together, and obviously he had plans that he was going to strangle China Boy. So China Boy ends up coming back in the cell, and who knows? Obviously, nobody was in there to watch how it happened. But obviously, at some point, China Boy must have had his back turned, and Psycho took advantage of that opportunity, put that rope around his neck, and the fight was on. He starts strangling him in the cell. And again, Psycho was a big dude. He probably outweighed China Boy by about 60, 70 pounds. So Psycho's on him, he's strangling him, and, you know, eventually China Boy loses consciousness. He loses consciousness, and, you know, he ends up killing him in the cell. After he kills him, he puts him in his bed, and he acts like nothing's going on. You know, he continues to go on about his day, and I guess it was football season or something, so there's other Sureños that are on the tier, and they're talking about a football pool or something, and he's out there bullshitting and joking on the tier. And then later on in the day, I guess, Psycho called out to another Sureño named Lumpy from Southside Ready Killers, and he ends up telling him, "Hey, calm man down. You know, there's something wrong with my celly. He's not breathing, and, you know, tell him to come get this body out of my cell. It smells like shit." And other Sureños on the tier, they hear that, and they're like, "What the fuck?" So they end up calling man down. They come in there. The CO comes up. They look at China Boy. He's in his bunk. He's not moving. They're telling him to move. He doesn't move. They cuff up Psycho, and they find out that China Boy's dead. So Psycho apparently, you know, he picked up on something, and he got the drop on China Boy. You know, this is an unfortunate situation. China Boy ends up pulling this guy. He puts, faith in him. He raises his hand for him, puts his neck out there. And at the end of the day, this guy snakes him and he ends up strangling him when he turns his back. It's a cold story. I ended up hearing about this when it first happened. And, I never heard the details or the specifics on it, but I just recently heard about, how it all went down. It's crazy. It's crazy. Anyway, I don't know what you could take away from this story. Maybe it's, if you don't know about somebody's past, maybe you shouldn't raise your hand for them or something like that, or never turn your back on somebody that is, in the process of getting green lighted. So rest in peace to China Boy. It's a messed up thing that happened to him. He was young when it happened, but these are the type of things that happen in prison. Anyways, you guys go ahead, drop your comments. Let me know what you think about it. I will drop that Inner Demons tomorrow. It's too late right now to get it out tonight, but I'll drop it tomorrow. Anyways, I hope you guys enjoyed this story. Rest in peace to China Boy. Regardless of the type of lifestyle he was living, he was still a human being. Anyways, let me know what you guys think about, this story. Drop your comments. If anybody has any feedback, if anybody did any time in federal prison, you guys were there, you have any knowledge of what happened, go ahead and drop those comments. With that being said, this is your boy B, and I'm out.